library was shipped in the very same pine cabinets that had stood in Jefferson's library for all those years. As the collection that Jefferson had built and lived with for nearly 50 years had pulled away, this is always a moment where I want people to really understand what has just happened. This is certainly the most prominent collection in North America at the time, and certainly one that defined the Enlightenment for America in many important ways. And Jefferson is suddenly finding himself standing in Monticello with 50 years worth of work being taken out the door, leaving him with a promise from Mr. Tickner that he'll come back with books. Jefferson did not respond to notes for a while, but finally sat down and wrote to Samuel Smith, who was a newspaper man and had helped him negotiate this sale with the government, and wrote that his collection was unquestionably the choicest collection of books in the United States, and that I hope it will not be without some general effect on the literature of our country. Catastrophic fire, as I told you, follows Jefferson again. And in Christmas Eve of 1851, a chimney fire erupts in the United States Capitol, and by the time it's put out, 2/3 of Thomas Jefferson's books are destroyed. The surviving volumes, which are now on permanent display at the Library of Congress, still serve Jefferson's driving purpose to have the sum of philosophical and practical endeavor available. In celebration of the library's bicentennial in the year 2000, we launched a program to reconstruct the entire 1815 collection by replacing 4,000 volumes that had been destroyed. Some of these matching editions were lost, that had been lost to fire, were located elsewhere in the Library of Congress collections. We are, after all, largely an 18th and early 19th century collection. Other missing works have been located and accumulated through gifts and mostly through purchase. This is a fairly complicated and ambitious project, but good progress has been made over the last 12 years. From the desiderata for the antiquarian market that we finally narrowed down to 1,012 items, we are now only lacking 297. So out of 4,000 missing books, we're down to 297, which I think is pretty good. The remaining titles are sought out on the antiquarian market still. We are seeking the scarce as well as the common, and I'm sure probably the imaginary. The arcane as well as the mundane. We're looking for books in 9 different languages at the moment, from 3 different centuries, published in all quarters of Europe and in the New Republic. When Jefferson's books arrived in Washington, the Library of Congress actually found its center and its impetus. Throughout his life, Jefferson had gathered books across a vast spectrum of topics and languages. The nation's library today, I believe largely because of this foundation, mirrors this approach to collecting. We remain the only national library in the world that collects universally across all topics and all languages. We have no border requirements, we have no language requirements. We remain the only national library that collects in this fashion. Jefferson's strategy for building the library was a practical one. It was really a working tool. This is not a bibliophile's monument. These are ordinary editions. Many of them are Dublin editions, which are notorious piracies. He liked a handy-sized book, he said, a book that was handy. But it was a touchstone, nonetheless, for all that Jefferson pursued in his life. As a statesman, a politician, a classicist, an inventor, a planter, a scientist, all of these can be found on his shelves. And in order to make them findable, he organized his books by subject. And what you're looking at is Jefferson's list of the first section of his collection. He mirrors the Enlightenment approach to human endeavor, mimicking Francis Bacon's organization of knowledge, and also mimicking the organization that D'Alembert uses in the Encyclopedia. That is, all human thought can be broken into memory, reason, and imagination. And as this chart tells us, books may be classed from the faculties of the mind, demonstrating memory, reason, or imagination, which when he applies them to his collection is simply called history, philosophy, and fine arts. This is the history page showing us that history is divided into civil and natural, and then ultimately a certain number of chapters, as he calls them. This library follows the notion of the Enlightenment because he is in fact creating the Enlightenment. And many of these aspects make perfect sense. What you're doing is creating a moment in which you can get up from your desk in the middle of a circle of books, go to the section that you need, find the book because it's organized in an order that makes sense, and sit down and get to work. This is not leisurely reading. He really sees these as source texts. Some of these topics are common to us: ancient history, modern history, physical mathematics, and others are 18th century conventions that we don't necessarily follow today. And while you look at Jefferson's collection, politics, law, history, all of them predominate, you would expect them to. It's important to remember that Thomas Jefferson's book collection as acquired by Congress also includes domestic sciences, foreign language dictionaries, rhetoric, poetry, routine working manuals. His Greek and Latin classics are there, his much beloved classics, especially Tacitus and Thucydides, as well as Plato, who he dismisses as such nonsense. So Jefferson took the section of memory, divides it into history, expected history, civil history, and then moves on to something quite odd, I guess, to the 20th century mind, which is natural history, so that partway down the chart we move from American history to geology. But nonetheless, this makes sense within his schema. Natural history, which is under reason, includes a lot of hard and applied sciences. It also is a moment in which we begin to see Jefferson's vast communication with scientists in Europe in particular. Several instances Jefferson has struck up very engaging and productive conversations with scientists. He corresponded with Priestley regarding the whole notion of phlogiston. He communicated with Lavoisier before his death, and then others regarding Lavoisier's theories afterwards. And that's part of his introduction to Buffon, who refers to chemistry as cookery and refers to a chemical lab as a mere kitchen, thus creating a certain atmosphere between their correspondence. Their correspondence, his correspondence with Georges-Louis Leclerc, who is Buffon, revolves mostly around his 10-volume work on natural history, which we're looking at a page here, History Naturelle. In it, Buffon expresses the most irritating notion that North America is innovating to any creature that exists, that it's degenerating and that animals are small, even the humans are small in North America, and goes on to an infuriating level of detail. Jefferson writes to him and asks him to rescind this notion. Buffon responds back in typical refutation, saying that he sees no reason to do so. Jefferson, in a grand moment, to refute this most irritating claim, enlists the American members of the Academy and asks them to send to Buffon the hides and the bones of very large animals. So Buffon is in fact inundated with animal parts. Jefferson writes to him by saying, "I'm happy to be able to present to you at this moment the bones and skin of a moose, the horns of another individual of the same species, the horns of the caribou, the elk, the deer, the spiked hornbuck, and the roebuck of America. Dear sir, I ask you to rescind." And the Frenchman actually ultimately changes his text. In a grand moment of bone, an avalanche of bones going to France. Reason and philosophy, the next section, is also bifurcated. That is, it's broken into moral philosophy, which in Jefferson's world includes religion and ethics, and then pure philosophy, which includes mathematics, astronomy, and most interesting to me, geography, for somehow is seen as pure philosophy. Jefferson's own preoccupation with religion as a moral code, as an ethical code, plays out in several options. Here what we're looking at is a rather substantial and probably surprising for some people series of materials about slavery, especially the issue of abolition, which are present in Jefferson's collection. This is Ramsey's work. Ramsey, by the way, an individual who profits and lives comfortably by the virtue of slavery, but nonetheless takes an abolitionist stance in this pamphlet. Most importantly, we find a relic of Jefferson's great admiration of Benjamin Franklin. And through a book dealer in Philadelphia, DeFeef, Jefferson acquires a series of bound pamphlets from Franklin's personal collection after they're sold.